Hey, it's Mike here, and today, regenerative grazing, eco-beef, environmentally friendly beef, whatever you want to call it, we are going to debunk some of the claims around it, and in particular focus on a recent 2020 study on White Oak Pastures. We're going to look at the carbon-related claims in this study, as well as ones previously made by White Oak Pastures. We're going to look at things like land use, conflicts of interest, and funding. We're just going to do our due diligence, and I have some help from Dr. Tushar Mehta, who is a data enthusiast who has done a deep dive into this, wrote an article on medium.com, so he will be here helping.
White Oak Pastures is essentially part of this global infrastructure. They present this real family farm kind of thing, which they use in the movies.
So let's graze the roof, go grazy, learn some Grey's Anatomy, and oh my gosh, I have an affliction. I just want to say I personally know a lot of people who are well-intentioned who have just bought the regenerative grazing thing hook, line, and sinker, and what's not to love about it if you eat beef? It's saying that you can save the planet while eating beef. Now, they might have seen Alan Savory's TED Talk, who's the poster child of grazing, or poster old South African dude, or just another presentation on some flashy carbon numbers or before and after pictures, and thought, this looks great, but they didn't get the full picture. And as we will cover, since that TED Talk by Alan Savory, this school of thought has been adopted as a marketing campaign by some of the largest food companies in existence. And I just want to say, yes, obviously I'm a vegan. I don't support eating animals, but I will say that when I was doing my sustainability degree, I bought into the Alan Savory thing. It was actually taught as a part of my degree. And even after being vegan for a few years, I just looked at it as, oh yeah, that's a more eco way to eat meat. Not much different than how chicken has a lower carbon footprint than beef does. But obviously I was like, oh, ethically, I don't support the eating of any animals. But what eventually shifted my perspective was the science showing that the claims made about these grazing techniques are just not correct. And of course, now we are looking at the newer generation of these claims, so let's go. That brings us to this paper in the journal Frontiers Sustainability subjournal. It's from late 2020, and it looked at White Oak Pastures, which they abbreviate as WOP, not to be confused with WAP, W-A-P. Children, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just ask Cardi B. Now for some of the basics of the studies, I'm going to go over to Dr. Tushar Mehta, who is one of the co-founders of plantbaseddata.org, which will be linked below. Here he is.
If we look at the baseline characteristics of the White Oaks Pastures, they're just very basic, is that they're 3,000 acre farm with mainly cattle, chickens, and pigs. There's some other animals too, but minority. It started on an area that's very degraded by prior peanut cotton farming and things like that. So it's using very degraded land. And we know that if you use degraded land to start with, you can then store more carbon in that land as you sort of bring it back up closer to a baseline.
So for the regenerative grazing sort of sequence, they start by adding compost, which is worth noting, and then they implement Alan Savory's holistic planned grazing, which is intensive rotational grazing with a host of other principles. So this video also should act as a response to Savory's methods, which are supposed to save the world. We'll see. So we have a pretty large operation here with a ton of different animals that started on degraded land. So what are the results after 20 years in terms of maybe land use and carbon savings?
And the claims they make is that they're, eco-friendly, and that they use 2.5 times the land for their animals as compared to conventional farming of the same animals, grouping them together, and 66% less carbon than regular animal agriculture, the comparison group that they're using.
So they say they use 66% less carbon than conventional systems. And I find that really interesting, which brings me to their previous 2019 report that I really briefly responded to in a Joe Rogan, Chris Kresser video, where they actually claimed that their beef was carbon negative. I just think it's funny that the moment these numbers have to make into a peer-reviewed journal, they go from being negative to, maybe just a third as much as a conventional system. Going to challenge that 66% figure with the carbon in a bit, but it's worth mentioning that that 2019 report was by Quantis, which is a sustainability consulting firm, so it was commissioned by the company. And as Tushar and his co-author mentioned in their article, Quantis is pretty questionable, makes things questionable because in their previously commissioned reports by Nestle, they concluded that allowing water bottles in national parks was ecologically all right. As your guide, I welcome you to Glacier National Park. Hey, don't you mean Glacier National Park? Now, common mistake, the park was purchased by Glacier, the beverage company owned by Coca-Cola. So what you're looking at is actually a solid wall of used plastic water bottles. Anyway, moving on. But you might be thinking, oh, Quantis, yeah, that was like a less reputable report, but this is a totally different study, unconnected. Well, it turns out the main author of that Quantis report is also an author of this Frontier study in 2020. And there's some other details about the authors, as Tushar mentions.
People who were the academics behind the study appear in movies like Sacred Cow and connect right back to Alan Savory. And then just within a few minutes later, their McDonald's and other chains are posting their things about eco meat. So it's kind of like a coordinated industry, multi-level sort of effort, it seems.
Sacred Cow is a pro-grazing documentary, and I don't want this to be enough to dismiss everything. We want to dismiss this on the actual paper, but it's also worth mentioning right up front the financial conflicts of interest, and that brings me to how this whole thing was funded entirely by General Mills.
Yes, well, it's 100% funded by General Mills.
But it's a mill. It's just milling plants.
It's just milling plants. Fortunately, they're milling everything. So they're like a multinational food company worth billions of dollars, and this is like a tiny thing for them to actually fund this study. The majority of the cattle meat that comes from White Oak Pastures is bought by General Mills for one of their eco products.
And General Mills does own Epic Provisions, and that is a meat company which is branded as if you're just hopping off your wagon on the Oregon Trail to grab some local jerky. What could be more eco than that? Well, technically, dying of dysentery would lower your emissions, but we're not trying to die. We're just trying to be more eco. All right, now let's take a closer look at what is probably the most important subject here, and that is the carbon situation. Especially in the documentaries and the presentations, there's this notion that there's some magical quality to grazing that leads to this extra sequestration that wouldn't occur if those animals weren't on the land. Like, large mammals are required, completely ignoring that there were, for example, no native large mammals in New Zealand, yet its ecosystem was able to form just fine. So if there are any issues here, what are they? Well, the first has to do with those other animals that happen to be on the farm besides the cows.
But indeed, there's an external factor that they admit using, that is using 10,000 pounds of hay per acre when they're sort of getting the land going in the early stages. Okay, that's fine. They did that once. But the thing that they don't really highlight in the paper is that aside from cattle, the monogastric animals, that means chickens and pigs, animals with one stomach that don't ruminate, they are completely fed, or mostly fed, by feed that comes from off of the land. It's external feed source.
Previously spoken about how Polyface Farms, another regenerative agriculture farm, was sort of exposed for doing this, dump trucking on massive amounts of grain from off-site.
They present together more than 50% of the animal carcass weight that is produced on that land. They feed 1.8 million kilograms of feed per year to these monogastric animals. And that produces a significant amount of manure every single year that is sourced from off-farm feed. This manure is applied to the land.
So most of the meat here is being created by off-site nutrients, which should rub any sustainability advocate the wrong way. Moving on. The next biggest factor here, as it always is with cows, is methane. And I mentioned this in almost every video on the topic, but oftentimes proponents of grazing go to that 100-year global warming potential, or just looking at the warming that happens within a 100-year time span based off different greenhouse gases.
So methane is accounted in 100-year timescales as opposed to 20-year timescales. In many cases, it's better to account it over 20 years because the half-life of methane is very short.
That 100-year time span puts methane in at about 32 times more powerful of a greenhouse gas than CO2. But then when you're cranking it down to that 20-year time frame, which is most relevant here, we're talking about 86 times more powerful than CO2. So looking to their chart, if their initial number is assumed to be correct, that 7.2 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year jumps up to about 19 million kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year. Ouch. So let's put that 19 million up against their sequestration, which is about 2,290 kilograms of carbon per hectare. Multiply that by about 1,200 hectares, and then you need to multiply that by 3.7 to turn the carbon into CO2. That's 10.3 million kilograms of CO2 sequestered, but we have about an additional 11.7 million due to the methane over 20 years to add to the total farm emissions. So instead of being 13 million, like they say, there actually would be closer to 25 million. So instead of just emitting a measly 3 million kilograms of CO2, the reality is that they're 5 times higher than that at nearly 15 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per year, totally destroyed. This further emphasizes that the claim of carbon negative beef that they had in their 2019 Quantis report is just complete and total nonsense. Especially, they said that it was more eco than a Beyond Burger or even straight soybeans, which are super low on the scale. And so it becomes very clear that when the same group of people, the same farm, the same project, showing a massively different figure in the peer-reviewed literature, that original Quantis report needs to be entirely disqualified, and if anybody uses it, they're using bad data. And furthermore, it should be illegal for White Oak Pastures to continue making claims that their beef is carbon negative and using graphics like these anyway, continuing on that 20-year time frame. That seems to be especially important when we look at what is called soil carbon saturation. Simply put, this is when the soil's carbon tank becomes full under the current type of system. So the soil's been fully saturated with carbon in terms of a grazing system, for example. Well, the documentaries will never go into this. The one seemingly unbiased thing that these two reports did in 2020 and 2019 were that they actually mentioned that this was occurring, and they go as far as to say that the slowing rate of sequestration, quote, may suggest a peak soil carbon accumulation at approximately 13 years, at which point they would just go back to spewing methane and the operational fossil fuels and not be storing anything else. Imagine how ridiculous it would be to promote a new special type of solar panel that after just 13 years starts burning coal. It's also worth noting they put a linear line on their soil carbon storage chart, but the dots look more like that hockey stick that is classic to a soil saturation chart. That's a much more realistic fit. So when we're talking about methane over a 15-year, even 13-year window, it becomes even worse because we're talking about the range of 100 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. You can start to see that this is not the best way to fight climate change. And you might have to ask, why does the soil become saturated? Why does this stop? And one likely reason is that because you have animals constantly grazing over this land, the grass is never getting more than about 2 feet high. The roots are not going to be getting super deep. Compare that to something like native big blue stem grass, which gets about 8 feet high with roots that go 12 feet deep. Or of course, trees with roots that can go like 100 feet deep. But it could be even worse because it's possible that we are undercounting methane in these ruminant systems even more. Here's Tushar.
So there's a really good paper called Underestimates of US Emissions and Global Implications for Industrializing Animal Agriculture by a professor, Matthew Hayek. Now, he's published this paper, and it's not in a peer-reviewed journal, but I think I've communicated with him, and I think that they're planning on getting this data published in a peer-reviewed journal. The calculations for methane from animal agriculture are what he considers bottom-up, meaning that they take the cattle and their manure and all the different things they do with the manure, as well as the different feeds for cattle and how long they live, etc. And they calculate that. They calculate the methane emissions based on that. Top-down measurements, for example, if you look at satellite data or from airplanes flying over and using different ways to scan for the methane emissions coming from animal agriculture operations, and other air measurements, generally it seems to exceed the bottom-up calculations.
So we have these standard bottom-up calculations, the ones which I'm guilty of using a lot of the time, where you go, okay, a cow emits this much methane, we're going to multiply that by 1,000 or whatever. And then we have the top-down, which can use imaging techniques to look at the air above the whole system, measure it, and get an estimate from there. The paper says top-down estimates indicate that the total U.S. animal methane emissions are 39 to 90% higher than bottom-up models predict, and that official reports like those by the EPA and in peer-reviewed literature are routinely underestimated. That is huge because you constantly hear the EPA's figure was low, beef is great. The paper says it's unclear why these are so low, throws out a few theories you can read in the link below, but I would love to see this peer-reviewed. Until then, moving on. Now I want to get into land use, which, as Tushar previously mentioned, was 2.5 times the land of a conventional system for this White Oak Pasture system. And this makes me wonder, what if we tried to adopt this globally? Well, here's Tushar.
Grazing itself uses a quarter of the land's usable surface. Okay, the majority of agricultural land is used by grazing, yet it provides only less than 2% of the world's protein.
And yes, that is actually from the FAO. 26% of terrestrial surface on planet Earth is used for grazing specifically. Add feed land, and globally 38% of our habitable land is used for livestock, so that 2.5 times would get this to about 96% of our habitable land, which is insane. Complete global adoption of this would cause food system collapse, probably. So it appears the question is, how much land do we have to throw in the operation to dilute the methane that is spewed by these cows? Is it like 1 cow per 3 acres, 4 acres, 5? You might as well just be buying carbon offsets at this point. All right, now I want to whip through a couple final topics, and one is the economic argument. I hear a lot that we need to have money coming in, a ton of money coming in, to be doing more sustainable farming, and beef is the way to pay for that because people will pay a lot of money for beef. And there's a bit of a paradox here. First of all, because this is a specialty product, this specialty eco beef fetches a higher price, so you can do things like pay for 2.5 times as much land, etc., or other intensive techniques. But as you scale this, which they say is necessary to achieve the results they want, then all of a sudden you're going to have a higher supply. This stuff is going to be worth less. So as more of this special eco cow flesh enters the market, you're going to have a harder time competing with conventional farms in terms of paying for all the extra labor and land and intensive stuff. You get the point there. And the other economic issue here is ignoring the fact that you can sequester carbon while getting an income from growing plants. And that brings me to regenerative agriculture that uses plants, because yes, regenerative agriculture is a very real thing.
But there's also conservation plant agriculture, where you use low tillage or no tillage and use a lot of organic and permaculture principles in your plant agriculture. So what you should be doing is not just comparing any kind of regenerative animal agriculture to the worst forms of plant agriculture. We should compare them appropriately to the better forms of plant agriculture that should be used.
You can use things like no-till, and you can plant plants with tap roots to deepen that soil, and you can use things like a roller crimper, keep the ground covered, and all of these things that help keep carbon in the ground, store more carbon. And it's just worth saying that even conventional nut farming, looking at that source of protein, is on average carbon negative. That's incredible. And I just have to mention cover cropping, because it's a great way to store carbon without methane emissions, where you just plant another crop between your main crop in the off season. And this study in the journal Nature that looked at a couple sites over 9 years found that the cover cropping led to an extra carbon storage of up to 2.2 tons of carbon per hectare, which is pretty much the entire White Oak Pastures storage. So that is massive. And I know there are people out there who just really want to believe in this grazing, and they're going to say, well, look at the land. The land really is regenerated. It is better. This is good. Shut up, Mr. Vegan. It is just a fact that you can regenerate an area of land while emitting a ton of carbon. I'm sure there's some McMansions around the US that have a garden that is massively regenerated compared to the bare dirt that it was. No, but they might have used 1,000 leaf blowers and crap to make it happen. So it is not true regeneration if you improve a certain aspect of a spot of land while you are massively spewing greenhouse gases and fueling potential climate catastrophe. And this is what is happening when you're emitting a ton of methane, especially looking at the 20 years that matter here, as you're reaching soil saturation in these white oak pasture systems and similar systems. So in the end, I think it's good that this Frontiers paper took the ridiculous claims of the initial Quantis report, brought them down to 66% better instead of carbon negative, because the idea that carbon negative beef exists is a very dangerous idea to have in the ethos of people that want to be eating beef, that will just latch on to anything that sounds good and just think beef eco in their head from there on.
It's hard. It's hard to hear things like, if you love to fly, that you got to fly less. If you love your car, that you got to drive less or have a smaller car, or use public transportation. And if you love to eat certain things, then we don't want to hear negative news about that stuff. So it's tough for people's stomach. So when they hear news from any source that says what they're doing is good, they're going to automatically, or more, just very high tendency to latch onto that good news, right? And that reinforces something that they desire, something they like, something that they see within their own benefit.
But that being said, again, between the soil saturation and the power of methane at 13 years, 100 times more than CO2, we're looking at a system that is not going to save the planet. It's probably not even going to help at all compared to conventional when you're talking about the atmosphere and greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So it is especially nowhere near as eco as these meat analogs that regularly trick people into thinking that they are actual animal flesh, as I've talked about before, like Glenn Beck. I think my hair just like popped out like a spring, but major thanks to Tushar Mehta, doctor, who inspired me to make this video. Definitely check out his plantbaseddata.org. I will link that below, as well as the original article he wrote for some extras, such as how they misused some citations in that study, or at least used them in a sketchy manner. So that's it. Feel free to like and subscribe. Make sure you get those notifications from me. And thanks for watching. This has been another episode of Graze and Frankie.